But here's the part. Almost no one talks about the part that turns this entire story from history into a warning. Because once a nation masters the art of turning war into profit, it doesn't just shape foreign policy. It shapes destiny. Think about it. A country that earns from chaos will never pray for peace. A system that grows when bombs fall will never truly want silence. And a financial empire built on conflict becomes addicted to it the same way banks become addicted to interest. Governments become addicted to war. This is why, even today, you see proxy wars erupting in regions most people can't even point to on a map. These aren't accidents. These aren't coincidences. These are pressure valves controlled instability, keeping the financial engine running. And behind every headline you read, behind every geopolitical tension, there is always a trail of contracts, currency flows, and economic interests that leads back to the same boardrooms, the same corporations, the same banks. They don't just watch the world burn. They calculate the returns. They decide who gets weapons, who gets sanctions, who gets aid, and who gets abandoned. And the most terrifying part, they do it with your money, your taxes, your currency, your future. The inflation that eats your savings is just the echo of decisions made thousands of miles away. The debt your government accumulates is the cost of deals you never voted for. The wars you hear about are not the wars being fought, because the real war is silent. It is the war between the people who pay the price and the people who profit from the price being paid. And unless you learn to understand this system, unless you learn to read between the lines, you are not just an observer of history, you are collateral damage in an economic battlefield designed without your consent. And that is why channels like this exist, to expose the architecture they never want you to see. Because the moment you understand how the world really works, the moment you see the connection between conflict and currency, between bombs and balance sheets, between crises and cash flow, you stop being a pawn in their game. You stop becoming a player. And once you become a player, you can no longer be controlled. This is System X, and this is just the beginning. This is the story they never wanted you to understand, the story where money, power, and blood merge into one invisible empire. Because in modern history, wars were never just wars. They were business strategies, financial blueprints, and carefully engineered opportunities that reshaped the world, while ordinary people believed they were fighting for freedom. The truth is darker. Every conflict from the last century to today wasn't only fought on battlefields. It was fought inside banks, inside treasuries, inside boardrooms. And the nation that mastered this hidden game the most, the United States. To see how deep this rabbit hole goes, you have to go back to the First World War, when Europe was drowning in its own blood and debt. Armies were collapsing, empires were burning, and governments were going bankrupt at a speed never seen before. But across the ocean, America watched silently, not as a savior, but as an investor. While Britain and France begged for guns, food, steel, ships, and ammunition, Wall Street stepped forward, not with sympathy, but with contracts. J.P. Morgan's bankers did not just lend money, they became the financial commanders of the Allied war effort. Every shell fired, every rifle produced, every loaf of bread shipped across the Atlantic came with interest. Billions of dollars flowed from the U.S. into Europe, and billions of profits flowed back to Wall Street. The U.S. eventually entered the war in 1917, but long before soldiers crossed the ocean, American banks had already tied their fate to the Allied victory. Losing was not an option, not for democracy, but for profit. And when the war ended, a new model had been born. A model where national patriotism was financed through debt, and ordinary citizens were turned into lenders via Liberty bonds, marketed with posters, celebrities, and emotional propaganda. Citizens believed they were helping win the war. Wall Street knew they were building a system. That system matured in the Second World War. By the time Hitler marched across Europe, American factories were already humming like engines of fate. Roosevelt promised to be the arsenal of democracy, but behind that slogan stood a machinery of guaranteed contracts, risk-free profits, and government-backed corporate expansion. Companies like Ford, GM, Boeing, and GE made fortunes so massive that even the Great Depression couldn't stop them. And to pay for the war, the government repeated the formula. Issue bonds, print money, mobilized the public financially. Over $185 billion were raised, an amount that stunned the world, but the real transformation was happening underneath. The gold standard quietly cracked, and the U.S. used the chaos to redesign the global monetary system entirely. At Bretton Woods in 1944, the dollar became the center of the financial universe, and that wasn't an accident. It was a reward for financing two global wars. Money had replaced gold. Debt had replaced restraint, and America had replaced every empire that came before it. When the Cold War began, the pattern only grew stronger. Military spending became permanent. Defense budgets became untouchable. Entire industries, towns, and states came to depend on Pentagon contracts for survival. Economists even invented a new term for it: military Keynesianism. The idea that constant preparation for war could keep an economy alive. And when Vietnam erupted, that theory became reality. The war cost more than $100 billion. Lives were lost. Charles followed, but the financial network expanded. Inflation skyrocketed. Deficits exploded, and in 1971, Nixon severed the last link between the dollar and gold, making money fully fiat, backed only by belief and by military power. The modern financial system, the one we live in today, was born inside a war. Most Americans now want to forget. But the story didn't stop. The Middle East crises of the 1970s brought a brilliant but ruthless strategy to force all oil to be traded in US dollars. That meant every nation from Europe to Asia needed American currency to keep their economies running. Military bases, alliances, and interventions ensured the system stayed intact. Money and war had merged into a single global engine. By the time the Gulf War broadcast itself on TV in 1991, the financialization of conflict reached Hollywood levels. Precision bombs weren't just weapons. They were advertisements for defense companies whose stock prices soared with every explosion shown on CNN. Then came the true financial earthquake, 9/11s. Overnight, the war on terror became a trillion-dollar business. Afghanistan and Iraq drained $6 trillion from taxpayers, but poured unimaginable wealth into contractors like Halliburton, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Blackwater. These wars didn't need victories. They needed duration. Contractors made money whether the mission succeeded or failed. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve kept pumping cheap debt into the system so the government could keep paying the bills. Ordinary Americans paid through inflation, taxes, and a national debt that ballooned beyond comprehension. The shocking part: America didn't win in Iraq. It didn't win in Afghanistan. But financially, the wars were a massive success for those who mattered. And this is the hidden architecture of modern power. Wars don't need winners. They need funders. When you understand this, you understand why defense spending remains above $800 billion every single year. You understand why military bases cover the planet. You understand why crises never truly end. They evolve. Because for those who control money, chaos is not a threat. It is an opportunity. War, crisis, instability, recession. These are the seasons of profit. That's why the 2008 financial collapse was handled using the same wartime playbook. Bailouts, guarantees, and trillions siphoned upward. That's why the pandemic saw massive money printing that enriched corporations more than citizens. That's why inflation today is not a mystery. It is a side effect of a system built on endless debt and endless spending. You live inside an economic battlefield. You feel it every time your groceries cost more, every time taxes rise, every time your currency loses value. Others fight wars with guns. You fight wars with your wallet. So remember this: when governments speak of freedom, look at where the money flows. When leaders call for intervention, ask who profits. When a new crisis appears on your screen, ask who benefits financially. History doesn't repeat, but the financial patterns behind wars do, because the real battlefield isn't in foreign countries. It's in financial markets, bond auctions, defense budgets, and central banks. And unless you understand this invisible war, you are not a citizen. You are a revenue stream. This is System X, revealing the truths buried under empires, money, and power. If this changed the way you see history, Hit subscribe because the world is not what it tells you it is. And here, we show you what really lies beneath.